The moment I saw the moving truck in my driveway, I realized someone had made a decision about my life without asking me. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 72 years old, and I have lived in the same house for nearly 30 years. It is not a mansion. It is not a luxury estate. It is simply a comfortable home filled with memories, photographs, and reminders of a life I built with my late husband. Every room carries a story. Every corner holds a piece of our family history. That quiet Tuesday morning began like any other. I watered the flowers on my front porch, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and settled into my favorite chair near the living room window. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children were in school. Most people were at work. Nothing seemed unusual until I heard the sound of a large engine approaching. First, I assumed it was a delivery truck. Then I looked outside and froze. A moving truck was slowly backing into my driveway. I stood up immediately and walked closer to the window. The truck was enormous, the kind families use when relocating across town. Before I could make sense of what I was seeing, the driver's door opened. My son Michael stepped out. Moments later, my daughter-in-law Ashley appeared on the passenger side. Both of them looked strangely cheerful. I opened the front door before they reached the porch. "Michael," I asked, "what is going on?" Instead of answering directly, he smiled. "Good morning, Mom." Ashley stepped forward carrying a folder and a travel mug. "This is going to be great," she said enthusiastically. Great. Whenever people announce that something is going to be great before explaining it, experience has taught me to be cautious. I glanced past them toward the moving truck. "Why is there a moving truck in my driveway?" Michael exchanged a quick look with Ashley. Then he laughed as though the answer were obvious. "We are moving in." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. "You are what?" "Moving in," he repeated. "We talked about it and decided it makes the most sense." Decided. That word immediately caught my attention. Not discussed. Not suggested. Decided. Ashley nodded. "The kids will love having more space. And honestly, this house is much too large for one person." I remained completely still. Neither of them seemed to notice that nobody had actually asked for my opinion. Behind them, two workers began opening the back of the truck. Furniture was visible inside. Boxes, lamps, household items. They had not come to discuss a possibility. They had arrived with a plan already in motion. Michael smiled confidently and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Do not worry, Mom. We have everything figured out." I looked at my son. Then I looked at the truck. Then I looked at the workers preparing to unload their belongings onto my property. And in that moment, while everyone expected resistance, anger, or panic, I simply smiled. Because Michael and Ashley believed they were arriving at the beginning of their plan. What they did not know was that their plan was about to become the biggest mistake they had ever made. For several seconds, nobody moved. The workers stood beside the truck waiting for instructions. Michael looked completely relaxed. Ashley was already scanning the house as though she were planning where furniture would go. The confidence on their faces told me this was not a spontaneous decision. They had discussed it extensively. They had organized the truck. They had packed their belongings. They had hired movers. Somewhere during that process, they convinced themselves that my agreement was unnecessary. "When exactly were you planning to tell me about this?" I asked calmly. Michael smiled. "We are telling you now." Ashley laughed lightly. "We wanted it to be a surprise." À surprise. That was one way to describe arriving at someone's home with enough furniture to fill several rooms. I looked toward the truck again. More boxes were visible inside. Children's bicycles, storage bins, lamps, chairs. An entire household was sitting in my driveway. "The kids will each have their own room," Ashley continued. "And you will not be alone anymore." I noticed something interesting. Every explanation focused on what they wanted. What the children wanted. What was convenient for their family. Nobody had mentioned what I wanted. Michael stepped closer. "Mom, this makes sense financially too. We can all help each other." There it was. The real motivation had finally appeared. Not concern. Not family togetherness. Convenience. I nodded thoughtfully. "I see." My calm response seemed to encourage them. Ashley immediately turned toward the movers. "The bedrooms upstairs should be first." One of the workers grabbed a dolly and started toward the truck. That was when I raised my hand. Please wait. Everyone stopped. Michael looked confused. What is wrong? I smiled politely. Nothing is wrong. I simply have a few questions. Ashley folded her arms. The excitement on her face began fading. Questions were apparently not part of their plan. What questions? She asked. Simple ones, I replied. How long were you planning to stay? Michael shrugged. As long as necessary. Several months. I asked. Maybe. Several years. His hesitation gave me the answer. Ashley quickly jumped in. We would all be happier together. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. The conversation continued for another few minutes. With every answer, the situation became clearer. They were not asking for temporary help. They were attempting to redesign my life without permission. More importantly, they genuinely believed I would accept it. Finally, Michael smiled again and gestured toward the house. Come on, Mom. This is good news. I looked at my son carefully. 44 years old. Successful career. Nice family. Yet somehow he still believed that making decisions for someone else was the same thing as helping them. The movers remained standing near the truck, waiting. Ashley checked her watch impatiently. The entire operation seemed ready to begin. Then I did something unexpected. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Neither Michael nor Ashley appeared concerned. In fact, Ashley smiled. Calling someone to share the good news? She asked. I returned her smile. Something like that. Then I scrolled through my contacts and selected a name. A very specific name. The moment I pressed the call button, a feeling of relief settled over me. Because while my son and daughter-in-law believed this day marked the beginning of their new arrangement, I knew it actually marked the beginning of a very different conversation. The phone rang only once before David Carter answered. Good morning, Eleanor, he said. His calm voice immediately caught Michael's attention. My son recognized the name. Ashley did too. The confidence they had displayed all morning began to soften. David, I said pleasantly, I believe we may need that conversation we discussed a few months ago. There was a brief pause. Has something happened? He asked. I glanced toward the moving truck. Two movers were standing awkwardly beside a stack of boxes. Michael shifted his weight uncomfortably. Ashley folded her arms. You could say that, I replied. David listened as I briefly explained the situation. I kept my tone friendly and factual. No accusations. No complaints. Just facts. When I finished, he laughed softly. I will be there within 30 minutes. After ending the call, I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Michael frowned. Why did you call David? Because I thought professional advice might be useful. Ashley exchanged a nervous glance with him. Professional advice for what? She asked. I smiled. For understanding the situation correctly. The uncertainty on their faces grew. Until that moment, they had assumed the entire day would unfold according to their expectations. Now they were realizing there were details they did not understand. We moved into the living room while waiting. Nobody mentioned unloading furniture again. The movers remained outside beside the truck. Every few minutes, one of them looked toward the house, clearly wondering why nothing was happening. The silence inside became increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, Michael spoke. Mom, this is not necessary. What is not necessary? I asked. Calling lawyers. I leaned back in my chair. Then perhaps arriving with a moving truck before discussing it was also unnecessary. That answer ended the conversation immediately. Ashley looked toward the family photographs displayed across the room. Pictures from holidays, graduations, birthdays, and anniversaries covered the walls. Every image represented decades of memories. Every frame reminded me why I refused to let anyone make decisions on my behalf. About 25 minutes later, a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. David stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. The moment Michael saw it, his confidence weakened further. David entered the house with a warm smile and greeted everyone politely. Then he sat down and placed the briefcase on the coffee table. Before we continue, he said, looking at Michael and Ashley, I think it would be helpful if everyone understood a few important details. Ashley attempted a nervous laugh. What kind of details? David opened the briefcase and removed a folder. The expression on his face remained pleasant, but professional. Details concerning this property. For the first time all morning nobody spoke. The room became completely silent. I watched Michael carefully. He had always believed he understood my affairs. He believed he knew how everything was arranged. But assumptions and facts are rarely the same thing. As David opened the folder and organized several documents on the table, I felt surprisingly calm. My son and daughter-in-law thought they had arrived at the beginning of a new chapter. They were about to discover that the story they imagined existed only in their own minds. David adjusted the documents on the coffee table and looked directly at Michael and Ashley. His voice remained calm and professional. Before anyone makes decisions involving this property, it is important to understand how ownership and control are structured. Michael crossed his arms. I already know the house belongs to Mom. David nodded. That is true. But that is only part of the picture. Ashley leaned forward. The confidence she carried earlier that morning had almost completely disappeared. David opened the first document and placed it where everyone could see it. Several years ago, Eleanor established a legal framework to protect both her residence and certain family assets. Michael frowned. What does that have to do with us moving in? David smiled politely. Quite a lot, actually. The room grew quiet again. Outside, the movers remained beside the truck, occasionally glancing toward the house. Inside, every word suddenly felt important. David continued explaining. Over the years, Eleanor had carefully organized her affairs with long-term planning in mind. The property was protected by agreements that were designed to prevent unauthorized occupancy arrangements, ownership misunderstandings, and future disputes. Nothing unusual. Nothing secretive. Simply responsible planning. Michael's expression changed with every sentence. He had clearly assumed the situation was straightforward. He had assumed family relationships automatically granted privileges that did not actually exist. So what exactly are you saying? He finally asked. David folded his hands. I am saying that nobody can simply move into this residence without Eleanor's explicit approval, and without certain legal considerations being addressed first. Ashley looked stunned. Legal considerations? Yes. David opened another folder. Extended occupancy creates responsibilities, liabilities, insurance implications, and financial obligations that must be evaluated properly. For the first time all morning, neither Michael nor Ashley had an immediate response. I remained silent. There was no need for me to argue. Facts were doing the work. David turned another page. More importantly, Eleanor has spent years ensuring that future decisions involving this property remain entirely under her control. Michael looked at me. You planned all of this? I smiled gently. I planned for many possibilities. Responsible adults usually do. His shoulders dropped slightly. I could see him beginning to understand the larger issue. This was never about paperwork alone. It was about respect. They had arrived believing my consent was a formality. Now they were discovering that consent was the foundation. After several moments, Ashley spoke quietly. We honestly thought we were helping. I looked at her carefully. Helping someone begins by asking what they need. Her eyes lowered immediately. That single sentence seemed to hit harder than any legal explanation. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension. This silence carried reflection, awareness, understanding. Eventually, David closed the folders and placed them back into his briefcase. The good news, he said pleasantly, is that problems are easiest to solve before mistakes are made. Michael slowly nodded. Outside the front window, the moving truck still sat in the driveway exactly where it had been all morning. Yet somehow it looked very different now. Just a truck. Just boxes. Just a plan built on assumptions. And as I watched my son staring thoughtfully at the documents, I realized the first real crack had finally appeared in the certainty that brought him to my doorstep. After David finished speaking, nobody rushed toward the moving truck. Nobody gave instructions to the movers. The energy that had fueled the entire morning had vanished. Michael sat quietly on the sofa staring at the documents spread across the coffee table. Ashley remained beside him, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by uncertainty. For years I had watched my son approach challenges with confidence. Usually that confidence served him well. This time, however, confidence had become assumption, and assumption had carried him directly into a situation he did not understand. David gathered several papers and handed copies to Michael. "I recommend reviewing everything carefully," he said. Michael accepted them without argument. That alone told me how much his perspective had shifted in only a few hours. Earlier that morning he arrived believing decisions had already been made. Now he was discovering that responsible decisions begin with information, not expectations. Ashley finally broke the silence. "We never meant to create a problem." Her voice sounded sincere. I believed her. The issue was not malice. The issue was entitlement disguised as practicality. They had convinced themselves that because a plan seemed logical to them, everyone else would automatically agree. Unfortunately, families do not function well when one side makes decisions for the other. "I know you did not intend harm," I replied gently. "But intent and impact are not always the same." Ashley lowered her eyes. Michael nodded slowly. The lesson seemed to settle deeper. Outside, one of the movers approached the front door and knocked politely. Michael stood and stepped outside to speak with him. Through the window, I watched the conversation. The mover pointed toward the truck. Michael rubbed his forehead and shook his head. A few minutes later, the mover returned to his coworkers. No boxes were unloaded. No furniture entered the house. The entire operation had come to a standstill. When Michael returned inside, he looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally, as though several assumptions had aged years in a single afternoon. "I should have talked to you first," he admitted. It was the first direct acknowledgement of the real problem. Not the paperwork. Not the legal structure. The lack of respect. I smiled softly. "Yes, you should have." There was no anger in my voice. There did not need to be. Truth carries enough weight on its own. David checked his watch before standing. "I think everyone has enough information for one day." We all laughed lightly, grateful for the release of tension. Before leaving, he shook Michael's hand. "Good planning prevents difficult situations." Michael nodded. "I understand that now." After David departed, the house became quiet again. Ashley sat beside the window looking toward the truck. Michael reviewed the documents once more. Neither seemed interested in arguing anymore. They were thinking, processing, learning. And as I watched them, I realized something important. The moving truck was never the real story. The real story was what brought it here. The belief that my life could be rearranged without my involvement. That belief was beginning to crumble. And once a false belief starts breaking apart, the truth has room to enter. What neither Michael nor Ashley realized yet was that there was still one more piece of information they had not heard. One final detail that would change the entire conversation and make them understand exactly why I had remained so calm from the very beginning. After several minutes of silence, I stood and walked toward a cabinet in the dining room. Michael and Ashley watched curiously as I removed an old blue folder that had not been opened in years. When I returned to the living room, I placed it beside the documents David had left behind. "There is one more thing you should understand," I said. Michael looked exhausted. "What now?" I opened the folder and carefully removed several photographs, letters, and records. The first photograph showed my late husband standing beside the house shortly after we purchased it. The second showed us planting the oak tree that now shaded half the backyard. The third showed Michael as a young boy holding a toy truck in the driveway. For a moment nobody spoke. Then I handed Michael a letter written in his father's handwriting. His expression immediately changed. "I have not seen this before," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, "because you were not ready to appreciate it before." He unfolded the letter and began reading. The room remained silent. Ashley moved closer to look over his shoulder. As he read, his eyes slowly widened. The letter contained something simple but powerful. It was not about money. It was not about inheritance. It was about responsibility. His father had written about the importance of respecting people before possessions, about protecting family relationships before pursuing personal convenience, about understanding that a home is more than a building. It is trust, memory, sacrifice. When Michael finished reading, he stared at the page for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me. "Dad wrote this." I nodded. A few months before he passed away. Ashley wiped her eyes. The atmosphere inside the room had completely changed. Earlier that morning everyone had been focused on logistics, space, and practical arrangements. Now the conversation was about values, about respect, about the meaning behind the house itself. I sat down across from them. This home survived difficult years, I said softly. It survived grief. It survived financial challenges. It survived uncertainty. Your father and I built a life here, one careful decision at a time. Michael lowered his eyes. And I showed up with a moving truck. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment in himself. I appreciated that honesty. It meant the lesson was finally reaching him. Outside, the movers began quietly closing the back of the truck. Nobody had asked them to do it. They simply recognized that the situation had changed. Ashley reached for my hand. We should have talked to you first. Yes, I replied gently. You should have. This time there was no defensiveness. No excuses. Only understanding. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the living room floor, I realized something important. The battle I thought might happen was never necessary. Facts had replaced assumptions. Reflection had replaced entitlement. The moving truck that arrived carrying certainty was preparing to leave carrying humility. And although neither Michael nor Ashley knew it yet, the most important decision of the day was still waiting to be made. As the last of the afternoon sunlight drifted across the living room, Michael sat quietly holding his father's letter. He had read it 3 times already. Each time he seemed to discover something new hidden between the lines. Ashley remained beside him, unusually silent. The moving truck still occupied the driveway, but nobody appeared interested in unloading it anymore. The urgency that had brought them to my doorstep had completely disappeared. Instead, something far more important had taken its place. Reflection. After several minutes, Michael finally looked up. Mom, why did you never show me this letter before? I smiled gently. Because lessons arrive when people are ready to hear them. He nodded slowly. For perhaps the first time that day, he was listening instead of planning. That difference mattered. The house felt peaceful again. Not because the problem had vanished, but because the truth had finally entered the room. Ashley leaned forward. Can I ask you something? Of course, I replied. Were you angry when you saw the truck? The question surprised me. I considered it carefully before answering. No. Both of them looked confused. Not angry? Michael asked. No, I said again. I was disappointed. He lowered his eyes immediately. He understood the difference now. Anger can fade quickly. Disappointment stays longer because it comes from expectations. I expected my son to speak with me before making decisions that affected my life. That expectation was reasonable. The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. Finally, I stood and walked toward the kitchen. Would anyone like coffee? The simple question broke the tension. A few minutes later, all 3 of us sat around the dining table with fresh cups in front of us. The atmosphere felt remarkably different from the one that existed earlier that morning. We were no longer opponents discussing a conflict. We were family discussing a mistake. Michael stared into his coffee. The truth is, Ashley and I have been under pressure. I listened without interrupting. He explained rising expenses, limited space, growing children, and the stress of balancing work and family responsibilities. For the first time all day, he was not defending a decision. He was sharing a burden. That honesty changed everything. Ashley admitted they had convinced themselves that moving into my house would solve several problems at once. They focused so heavily on the benefits that they never stopped to consider the consequences. We thought we were being practical, she said quietly. But we never asked what you wanted. I appreciated her honesty. Not because it erased the mistake, but because it acknowledged it. Outside, the movers began preparing the truck for departure. The sound of closing doors echoed faintly through the windows. Michael glanced toward the driveway and shook his head. I cannot believe we actually thought this was a good idea. I laughed softly. People often confuse confidence with wisdom. Even he smiled at that. The conversation continued for another hour. No arguments. No accusations. Just honesty. And by the time evening arrived, I realized the most important victory had nothing to do with documents, legal protections, or property rights. The real victory was watching my son begin to understand that respect is not demonstrated through grand gestures. It is demonstrated through simple acts of consideration. What happened next, however, would prove whether that lesson had truly taken root. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The events of the previous day replayed quietly in my mind as I made breakfast and watched the sunrise through the kitchen window. For the first time in many hours, the driveway was empty. The moving truck was gone. The boxes were gone. The pressure that had arrived so suddenly had disappeared. Yet I knew the story was not finished. Around 10 o'clock my phone rang. It was Michael. His voice sounded different. Lighter somehow. "Are you busy today?" he asked. "Not particularly," I replied. "Why?" There was a brief pause. "Ashley and I would like to stop by." I smiled. "Of course." An hour later, their car pulled into the driveway. This time there was no truck. No movers. No assumptions. Just family. When they entered the house, I immediately noticed something unusual. Michael was carrying a small wooden box. Ashley held a photo album. Neither explained anything right away. We sat together in the living room. Finally, Michael placed the box on the coffee table. "We found this while unpacking some old things," he said. Carefully, he opened the lid. Inside were photographs, letters, school drawings, and dozens of memories I had not seen in years. Some belonged to my late husband. Some belonged to Michael's childhood. Others captured holidays and family gatherings stretching back decades. Ashley opened the photo album and began turning pages. As we looked through them together, the atmosphere became warm and nostalgic. We laughed at old hairstyles. We remembered family vacations. We talked about moments that had almost been forgotten. Then Michael stopped on one particular photograph. It showed him as a young boy standing beside his father in the backyard, both of them smiling proudly beside a tree they had planted together. The same tree that now towered over the property. He stared at the picture for a long moment. "I forgot how much of my life happened here," he said quietly. "That is what I wanted you to understand," I replied. "A house is not just square footage. It is memory." He nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Ashley reached into her purse and handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. First, I thought it might be an apology. It was something far more meaningful. It was a promise. Together, they had written about respecting boundaries, communicating openly, and involving me in future decisions instead of making assumptions. Every sentence felt thoughtful. Every word felt sincere. By the time I finished reading, I realized the lesson had moved beyond that single day. It had become part of how they wanted to live moving forward. Later that afternoon, we sat on the back porch watching the grandchildren play beneath the old oak tree. The same tree from the photograph. The same tree planted decades earlier. Life had a funny way of creating full circles. The conflict that began with certainty and entitlement had ended with understanding and respect. And as I watched my son laughing with his children in the backyard, I realized something important. The greatest victories are not the moments when someone loses. The greatest victories are the moments when someone grows. What happened next would show whether that growth was truly permanent, but for the first time since the moving truck arrived, I felt completely at peace. Nearly a year passed before I fully understood how much that day had changed our family. Life returned to its normal rhythm, but the relationships within it felt stronger, healthier, and more honest. Michael and Ashley never again made decisions on my behalf without including me in the conversation. In fact, they began doing something that seemed remarkably simple but carried tremendous meaning. They asked. They asked for advice. They asked for opinions. They asked how I felt about plans that affected the family. Those questions restored something that had quietly been missing long before the moving truck arrived. Respect. One Saturday afternoon, the entire family gathered at my house for a barbecue. The grandchildren played beneath the oak tree while laughter drifted across the backyard. Watching them run through the grass, I found myself thinking about the strange chain of events that had started everything. At the time, the moving truck felt like a crisis. Looking back, it was actually a lesson disguised as a problem. Sometimes life presents us with moments that reveal who we are. Other times, it presents moments that reveal who we still need to become. Michael walked over carrying 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to me. We sat quietly on the porch for several minutes, watching the children play. Finally, he smiled. You know, I still think about that day. I laughed softly. So do I. He shook his head. I cannot believe I convinced myself that showing up with a moving truck was reasonable. People see what they want to see when they are focused on solving their own problems, I replied. The important thing is what happens after they realize they were wrong. He nodded thoughtfully. I learned more from that day than I did from years of success. That statement stayed with me. Success teaches confidence. Mistakes teach wisdom. Both are valuable, but only one creates humility. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, I looked at each person in the room. Ashley was helping serve dessert. The grandchildren were sharing stories from school. Michael was laughing with relatives. The atmosphere felt warm and genuine. Not because we were perfect, because we had learned. Before everyone left, Michael stood and raised his glass. The room quieted. I want to thank Mom, he said. Not because she was right about the house. Not because she protected herself. I want to thank her because she showed me that respect is something you practice every day, especially with the people closest to you. The room remained silent for a moment before several people nodded in agreement. I felt emotion rise in my chest, but it was not sadness. It was gratitude. Gratitude that the lesson had not been wasted. Gratitude that my son had chosen growth over pride. Gratitude that our family emerged stronger than before. As the evening ended and the last car disappeared down the street, I stood alone on the porch and looked toward the old oak tree. The same tree my husband and son planted decades earlier. The same tree that had quietly witnessed every chapter of our family's story. And in that peaceful moment, I realized the greatest victory was never keeping control of my home. The greatest victory was preserving something far more valuable. A family that finally understood that love without respect cannot thrive, but love strengthened by respect can endure for generations.